Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the new digital SAT. Is it for you? I'm Judi Robinovitz, college counselor, certified educational planner, and I've enjoyed working with students for, let me just say, more than 35 years at this point. And let's get right into the new digital SAT, because that's actually my whole background in how I got into the college counseling phase of my life. What can I say? We are broadcasting live on Facebook as well as YouTube. And there are a number of downloads for this evening's webinar. It depends whether you're watching us live or watching a video, the video of us. But you'll find our, either tonight when you go online right now, you can go to squarewebinar.com to get our downloads, or when you're watching the recording in the future, if that's what you're doing, YouTube video descriptions. Lots of great downloads. I want to say that our testing calendars that we have for current juniors and another one for current sophomores actually go beyond just the current year, but go into the future year as well, the following year, in terms of setting up an appropriate testing calendar and also helping to make a decision between SAT and ACT. So I hope you'll find that all of these downloads are pretty helpful for just reinforcing what I'm going to share with you this evening. So our initial focus is going to be on the new SAT, which is completely digital, starting in March of 2024 in the US. It's been digital internationally since 2023. It is very different from not only the previous SAT, but from pretty much any other standardized test that your students may have taken. And I think part of our goal tonight is to help you and students figure out, like, which is the better test, the digital SAT or the paper-based ACT. And hopefully the comparisons and the advantages and disadvantages we'll share with you this evening will help make that an easier decision so that students don't have to prep for both tests. So let's just start with a very high-level overview of the digital SAT. It is considered to be a test that is divided into two sections, a reading section and a writing section. Oh, but wait, they are what's called section adaptive, and I am going to go into a bigger description of that, but a linear or paper-based test is not adaptive. It doesn't react to you based on how you've answered other, earlier questions in the test. So each section is divided into two subsections, or College Board likes to call them modules, so we'll stick to their terminology. So a section is called, say, reading and writing together, and another section is math, but each of them have two modules. And there's a little bit more description about each of those modules. So they each begin with module 1, which I'm going to say is a baseline module. It has a very well-balanced mix of easy, medium, and difficult questions. So you're going to begin each section with just this baseline module, and you're going to move from module 1 to module 2 based on how well you did essentially on module 1. In other words, how many questions did you get right in module 1, and which specific questions, what level of difficulty were there? And there's not like a hard and fast rule where I can say that you have to, answer 60% of the questions right, and that half of them have to be medium or hard difficulty in order to go on to the harder module. There's no set exact rule for that, but just know that based on which questions you answer correctly and how many you answer correctly in module 1, you'll either go to a harder module or an easier module. And then based on your final performance of combining what you've done in each of those modules, you'll get your SAT score for that section, and it'll go between 200 and 800. That has not changed from the old SAT. And that's what we mean by adaptive. It adapts to your behavior, if you will. So essentially, your score is based on how many questions you answer right and which questions they are. Let's dig a little bit deeper now. Looking at, say, the reading and writing section, that module 1, the baseline module, is a little more than a half an hour, has 27 questions, so that you can see, you've got a fair amount of time for each question. There's a very short pause, and that's where the system's thinking, scoring and saying, oh, okay, she did super well and she's going on to module 2, or she didn't do quite that well and she's going on to module 2, at a lower level, so a higher level or a lower level. And each module is the same amount of time, in this case, just over a half an hour, and each has 27 questions. Math is set up very much the same way, with a baseline module and an easier or harder module 2. Also just slightly longer than the reading writing section, just, over a half an hour, and only 22 questions. And again, a short pause between module 1 and module 2. And there is a 10-minute break between the reading writing and the math. Oh, and there's 2 extra questions that are actually included in these numbers, the 22 and 27, that are pre-test, or some people call them experimental items, and an item is a question, that are not scored. It basically gives College Board a way to pre-test new questions, determine how hard or easy they are, if things need to be changed, but they're not scored, and there is really no way to figure out which questions didn't count. But we do know that there'll be 2 of them in each module that are not scored. So there have always been differences between, the SAT and the ACT, but now I want to say, and it's not really grammatically correct, but they are more different than they ever were before. The first and most obvious one is format, because SAT is exclusively digital, unless, of course, you require some kind of an accommodation that requires, or you've been granted a particular accommodation that requires a paper-based test, and in which case you will be able to take a paper-based test. And the ACT, at least for now, for the foreseeable future, for regular testing dates, is a paper and pencil test. Timing is very different. It was always different, but not this different. SAT is much, much shorter, as you can see, only 134 minutes. So that's just over 2 hours, and the ACT is almost 3 hours. So it's pretty much, one can say, 50% longer. But look how many more questions the ACT has than the SAT. And what that winds up giving a student is the fact that that student is going to have 50% more time per question on the SAT. So if you have a student who really loves, working on a keyboard, and of course, what student doesn't really love his or her devices, you have, much, much more time for each question, and I can work at a slower, more thoughtful pace on the SAT. But if you have the kind of kid who likes to be sort of a rapid thinker, that student might be much better off with a test that doesn't require as much deep thought to come up with the answers. Reading and writing are even more different than they used to be. I want to say content as well as format. First of all, ACT separates reading and writing. They don't call it writing, they call it English. So English is what ACT calls writing. Writing isn't exactly writing, by the way. It's grammar for the most part. So ACT separates that into 2 different sections, with section 1 of the 4-section ACT being the English or the writing section, and section 3, 2 sections later, being the reading section. Whereas SAT has now merged reading and writing passages, into one section. Remember, 2 modules, but each module is structured very, very similarly. And what you need to know is that all the reading questions in a module come before all the writing questions in a module. And by the way, the writing questions do tend to be easier for students. And there are definitely students who actually like to start each section, each module, sort of working backwards, working through the writing questions, because they're faster than the reading questions. And one other major difference here in the content, and I'll go into this in a little more detail, is the length of passages. Because as you probably remember with parent or student previous tests that you've taken, the reading comprehension or the writing passage was, a long passage, had many, many lines with many questions following it. Now with the new digital SAT, the passages are very, very short, whether it's reading or writing, and have just one question following it. So if it's an overwhelming passage that doesn't make sense, that a student is really struggling with, there's only one question. So you can, guess at it and move on to the next. Okay. This is a very similar difference. The science section, the difference is pretty similar to the way it's always been. ACT, last section of the test is science reasoning, whereas with SAT, there are science questions sprinkled, throughout the test, and there may be, some graphs or tables of data that have to be, explained, but that's in the context of reading or writing or even math. And then the actual physical writing of an essay. So SAT stopped testing the essay, I think it was 2021, and ACT still has an optional essay at the very end. When you register for the ACT, you register for it with or without the essay, but almost no one requires or even recommends the essay. So we typically tell our students to just register without the essay unless you're applying to a school or program that absolutely requires it. So let's move on to how do you determine which is better for you, the SAT or the ACT, which side of the scale is going to weigh more for you. So let's get down into the nitty-gritty comparison. I'm not going to keep telling you how much time and how many questions because you can read that, but we're looking at basically, two sections on the SAT, each with two modules. And so you can think of this maybe as 4 mini sections, but it's really a 2-section test. Whereas the ACT has 4 different sections to it, always in the order listed. And I've already explained that there's 2 non-scored experimental questions in each module for the SAT. ACT students may get 1 extra section at the very end of their ACT that is experimental. Not all students get that. Okay. A huge difference this year is the fact that SAT no longer gives you the opportunity to get back a copy of the test that you took, your answers, and the correct answers. It's a service that they've had through the paper-based test called the Question and Answer Service. It's no longer available, whereas the ACT still has the 3 test administrations, September, April, and June, where you can, when you register, request, or pay for the test information release, where you're getting back essentially digitally the questions that were on your test, your answers, the correct answers. It's just a wonderful tool to learn from your mistakes. Also, in terms of prep materials, ACT wins the contest by far because we have decades of existing practice tests, and I mean real ACTs, that have been released by the company that students can practice with, whereas SAT hasn't made that many practice tests available yet. And so there's some third-party materials, and we'll talk about that moving on. Digging a little deeper, looking at the structure, of reading. Again, reading and writing are together on the SAT. And when I say that there are, 27 passages in each module, or 54 passages in total, don't think, oh my God, long passage. How am I going to read 50 passages? No. It's it's 25 to 150 words is the passage length with a question. So you're going to see on your screen, the passage on one side and the question on the other side. And there will also be some paired passages, 2 passages about the same topic, but from 2 different perspectives. And typically there'll be 1 question paired with that paired passage. And it might ask you something like, what would the author of passage 1 think about the author's perspective in passage 2? So it's a comparison between the 2 passages. Whereas the ACT still has those same 4 reading passages. They're much longer, 700 to 900 words, and there's 10 questions, per passage. 3 of them are straightforward passages. 1 of them is going to be a paired passage, just like the SAT, author 1, author 2, but then 10 questions asking, about perhaps comparisons between the 2 passages. The left side of your screen, as you may have noticed, stayed the same. Here it is back for reading. I go into writing, only the right side has changed, because remember that the SAT mixes or blends the reading and writing passages together, with the reading passages first, the writing passages second within the module, whereas the ACT in a separate section has 5 of the English passages. They're long, 800 to 1,000 words each, and 15 questions per passage. So if you were comparing time, you don't want to compare just the ACT reading or the ACT writing, or English, I should say, to the SAT. You're looking for the total time of reading and writing, reading and English from the ACT to the total time of the SAT. And again, the ACT is much longer with many, many more questions. Let's look at content of reading. There's a lot of overlap between the content. However, ACT, we always know the order of the passages, whereas on the SAT, you never know the order of the passages. And in terms of the actual question types in the SAT versus ACT, writing and English, exactly the same, grammar and punctuation, etc. Very much testing the same skills. So it means if you're prepping for one test and you're like relearning or reinforcing your different grammar rules, your different punctuation rules, etc., whatever rules you're learning will apply equally to SAT and ACT. Now math, the question that's the part that the test that's closer to my heart as a math major in college anyway. Same thing we talked about before. SAT has the 2 modules, module 1, module 2. Each one has 22 questions. Some of them are multiple choice and some of them are what I like to call grid-in, because you're not really gridding in something, you're typing it, into, but a grid area, let's say, where it's not multiple choice. You're just coming up, with your own answer, but they don't give you the exact number that'll be multiple choice and grid, and there's an approximate number. Whereas the ACT is strictly multiple choice. Huge difference is the fact that the SAT provides you with the formulas for pretty much almost anything you would need, let's say, in geometry, whereas ACT does not give you the formulas. The SAT has changed and now allows a calculator across the entire math test. In the past, that wasn't the case. You were allowed to use a calculator on half the test, on half the math, and not on the other half. So both of them now allow a calculator throughout. But I will add that the SAT, and they have to be approved calculators, and there's a list on College Board website and ACT website on which calculators are approved. But there's a very special calculator that's included now with the digital SAT called Desmos. And there are some people who say if you really understand how to use the Desmos calculator, it's as close to cheating as you could get without cheating, because it can do almost everything that you need to do. And you can Google Desmos calculator and spend time to learn about it on your own, or perhaps take a brief course in effectively using the Desmos calculators. There's huge overlap in what's tested from algebra, geometry, probability, statistics, a little bit of trigonometry. I would say, though, the biggest difference between the distribution of content on SAT and ACT is the fact that algebra is king on the SAT. A huge percentage, perhaps 2/3 roughly, of the test is algebra, whereas on the ACT, the content is more evenly divided amongst, like algebra, geometry, trigonometry, probability, statistics. So if you're the kind of kid who loves geometry, for example, you might like the ACT better because there's more geometry on it. Science, already pretty much said it. The fact that ACT does have a science section, it's the 4th section. It doesn't really test your knowledge of things like biology or physics. It's more your reasoning abilities. And the SAT, while it does not have a science section, there are definitely science-inspired or science-related questions throughout the test where you might be analyzing, graphic data or a table or a STEM reading or writing passage. but it's not, separately scored, a science score. Are there any questions that have come up so far? Okay, let's just move along. And by the way, if you have a question, you can type it in, and I'll be stopping periodically to answer those questions. But let's sort of summarize what I've talked about with these, differences and some similarities between the two tests in terms of the advantages and disadvantages. So there definitely are some, SAT has plenty of advantages in terms of the fact that it's shorter. There's more time. You're doing it digitally, and kids, love keyboards. We think eventually you'll likely to get your score more quickly than you can on the ACT. There may not be as many security leaks, certainly not as much cheating, because if I look at my neighbor's, what she's doing right now and look on her screen, she's going to have a different test than I do, because the module ones are not going to be the same for everyone in the room. They will be the same in terms of, let's say, the percentage of easy, medium, hard questions, but they're going to be very different. So it's going to really reduce things like question leaks and cheating. And of course, that wonderful advantage with the SAT is that you can use that online Desmos calculator, which can do virtually everything. By the way, you can also bring your own calculator. You can use either one, or you don't have to even use a calculator, because there is no question on either the SAT or ACT that requires a calculator. Everything can be done by hand, and there's very little real arithmetic where the kids are going to be there for 10 minutes doing the arithmetic. That's not going to happen. So I think that there are a lot of advantages to the digital SAT. The biggest one in my mind is that kids love to be online, and that it's a shorter test with more time per question. But like with anything else, there's definitely disadvantages. So you need to have a reliable computer and reliable internet. And it's true that if you don't have your own device to bring in for the test, when you register for the SAT, you can request a device from College Board. But I think the kids who have better devices have more, more of an advantage, especially if, let's say, you have a really good mouse. You may find that a lot quicker than just using the keyboard to move forward or backwards through the test. You're definitely going to be dependent upon your battery, so you need to have some good battery life, and you may not have that many plugs available in the room in which you're taking the test, which means if you can find your own seat, if you're not just assigned to a seat, I'd certainly be looking for a seat that's near an outlet in case you have a plug that doesn't last, the full length, or, a battery that doesn't last the full length of the test. Another disadvantage is it's a brand new format, and it's not also scoring is so different. It's not just based on the number of questions that you get right. I don't like the fact that you cannot get back, a copy of the test that you took, and that there's not yet, and may not be for a few years yet, a lot of test prep material. Okay, looking at the other side, at the ACT, it's very predictable. I mean, they haven't changed the format, far back as I can remember, so we know what to expect. I think the ACT is given once more per year than the SAT. You can still get back a copy of your test. Essentially, it's a digital version of all the questions that you had. Your answers, the correct answers. It's called the test information release. It's available 3 times a year, so that's still ongoing for the ACT. And it's had years and years of quality test prep material in terms, of real tests. Okay, but some disadvantages, definitely longer, roughly an hour longer, and you must work quickly. So if you're the type of kid that really needs more time to think per question, you're probably not going to like the ACT. And it's not an adaptive test. It's sort of more of an old-fashioned test, if you will, just, a strictly linear test where your score is based on how many you got right. Any questions about advantages or disadvantages?
Are SAT reading questions similar to the paper ones?
Similar to?
The paper test.
Okay. So some of the questions are definitely going to be similar because they may be asking you about the main idea or some inference that you have to make. But remember that your question is based on a very, very short passage. And so you'll be able to go through it and find an answer more quickly. So College Board does give you a list of the types of questions. And in fact, we have another webinar that goes into much greater depth about the digital SAT. If you were to go on our website under Score Webinars, plural, you'd see our previous webinars. And there is one that goes into even more detail about the types of questions.
Many students with learning disabilities have historically preferred the ACT. Do you think that this will change with the new digital SAT format?
That is a great question, and I wish I had the answer. So the question is, many students with a learning disability previously did better on an ACT, preferred the ACT. Remember that you have a learning disability. You generally can get time and a half or double time. So we're no longer as rushed through the ACT. We can take more time. And the fact that, remember, ACT is designed, I would say, not to be as deep critical thinking as the SAT. The questions are designed to be answered more quickly. So now if I have double the time, it's definitely to my advantage. So the question really is, will I still have that advantage with the ACT over the digital SAT? I honestly don't know. And I think that it would behoove a student, for example, to get apply for and get extended time on both. You can use your digital PSAT to compare to a paper and pencil ACT in order to determine, when you're taking time and a half or double time, if you have more of an advantage as you did before, I think, with the ACT. But I don't know that anyone's come out yet to say which one might be better for a student, let's say, who's dyslexic or has dyscalculia or ADHD. Anything else, Jay?
Someone asked if your battery comment is excellent. I see that many computers will die during the test. If so, anything that can be done.
Okay. So basically what happens if your battery dies? Okay. So let's just say you have to go to a different location within the testing environment and plug in. You might have to, move to the front of the class or the back of the class. So first of all, you're not going to lose any time. It's only going to be your time that you're online. So your battery dies or even the internet dies and you get back online, you pick up where you left off. You're not going to lose any time. But if you're going to buy a new computer, get one with, I'd say, a 3-hour battery life so that you're more sure that your computer is not going to die on you.
Also, if you are using an iPad or even a regular computer, there are those batteries you can buy that you can plug into. You can plug a traditional computer into, or an iPad will go directly into it. I'm a big fan of the Anker devices. I put a link in the chat to go right to their website.
Okay, so I hope you heard all that you can have an external battery attached to your device and use that. And we're big fans of Anker, ANKOR? ER, ANKER. By the way, if you like our graphics like this one, I can tell you that my co-host, Jason, my son, actually worked with artificial intelligence, with AI, to come up with our own graphics. Okay, anyway.
One more question.
Oh, one more question.
Given the limited practice tests available for digital SAT, what are the implications for those being tutored for the March SAT?
Okay. The question had to do with test prep. Give me a minute. I'm going to get to that. But yes, there's definitely limited materials available, but I'll get to that. So let's talk about testing calendars. And much of this is downloadable, one of the handouts. So if you're currently a sophomore, I would strongly urge you to get a jump start on things, but primarily with the ACT. I'm a very firm believer in sophomores taking the ACT at the very end of the year. If you're in Palm Beach County, June 8th is after school gets out. I think if you're in Broward County, it's right around the time school gets out. Or if you have some of the summer to get ready for it, you can take it in September. ACT is a risk-free test. Most people don't know this, but you can cancel an ACT score after you get it. So if you're unhappy with your score, you can get in touch with ACT. They explain that on their website, and you can cancel your score. There's nothing, illegal or unethical about doing that. So if I take an ACT at the end of my sophomore year, I can compare it to my earlier in the sophomore year digital PSAT, because that's what the kids took earlier this year, or to next October's digital PSAT. And I can decide very early on whether I like the SAT better or the ACT better, or how much prep I really need to do, or if I ever want to take that ACT again. And the reason I have both the June and September tests starred here is because that's when test information release. Those are two of the times you can get back a copy of your test questions, your answers, the answer key, and even the conversion table that was used in determining your ACT score. And you'll get that a couple of weeks, after the test. I believe you get it even a couple of weeks after you get your score back. So as a sophomore, I'd love to get a jump start on this, and the only thing I can risk is my ego if I get a score I'm unhappy with, but it doesn't go on my permanent record. By the way, if you aren't in Palm Beach County, it does go on your transcript, but there's a way to get it taken off your transcript through the Board of Education. And that's something I would say, just contact me and I can explain how to do that. A sophomore going into her junior year, if she has all summer to prepare for the SAT without school interfering, and she's already completed Algebra 2, because remember the SAT is Algebra's king, could take the August test that's right around the time that school begins. So this works well if you have the summer to prepare for it. So I really do like my sophomores getting a jump start on the tests. If you're currently a junior, let's look at what's left the rest of the junior year. I would certainly take the ACT unless I'm positive that the digital SAT will be my better test. And again, all I can hurt by taking the ACT and getting a low score is my ego. And remember, I can get rid of that score. But if I take the test in either April or June, I can get back again a copy of the questions, etc., and learn from my mistakes. And because so much of the content of SAT and ACT still overlap, even if I never take another ACT again, I'm going to have an idea of, oh my God, I really don't do well on geometry questions, and I need to practice that more. Or I don't do well on reading inference questions, or on questions dealing with rhetoric. Okay. I think many juniors will wind up taking the ACT this semester, because basically they're using as a foundation the PSAT, the digital PSAT that they took back in October, got the scores back, the next month in November, and, have had since that point, let's say all the way through to March or May or June, time to prepare for an SAT. So I would consider, if I'm a junior, taking the SAT later this semester, either to compare this with my ACT experience, because I don't know which one I really prefer, or if I'm, this is written backwards, if I'm sure that the SAT is my better test, I'm definitely going to take that. And so there are some kids who will take SAT and ACT once to determine which is better, knowing they can get rid of their ACT scores. By the way, Broward County does not put any scores on your transcript if you're in a public school, and most private schools don't put scores on your transcript either. But these are the remaining dates for the digital SAT for this year. May 4th is right before AP exams begin. So there are some kids who don't, feel that they can study effectively for the SAT and APs or IBs or ACE, and may ignore the May test and think about the March test if they have enough time to prepare for it, or even the June test. Okay. But what happens next year? Because let's just say as a junior, you didn't get a high enough score for you to apply to or feel more confident about an application to a college. And yes, I know you're probably all thinking, oh, but there's test optional. We don't have to worry about the score. I promise I'm going to explain that as well. So what I've done is look at the next school year, the next testing year, 24-25, that begins, in the fall when the school year begins and ends in the summer. These are all the dates that SAT and ACT will be given. They have not yet been officially announced by the testing companies, but based on the patterns that we have seen over the past many years of, hey, the SAT is always the first weekend in December, and the ACT is always the second weekend in December. And by the way, they are never, they're never given on the same date, so you don't have to worry about, oh my God, which one do I take? I have stored for you those that you can get back a copy of the test even as a senior to learn from your mistakes. But there are a few other things to keep in mind, because you cannot use all of these dates if you're a senior applying to college, because some of them will be too late. So if you're applying early decision or early action, which are application plans that allow you to apply that have a deadline, usually 1st of November or 15th of November. Yeah, there are some that are a little later, but these are the most common ones. And for virtually every school, it does improve your chances for admission. If you apply early decision, which is binding, means if I apply early decision, and I can only apply to one school early decision, if I get in, I must go. Early action, apply early, get an actionable decision, but that I'm not bound to relatively early. And typically for most ED or EA plans, you usually find out in December. I think University of Miami is an exception. I don't think you find out about EA until January. So if I'm applying to a school and there's a November 1 deadline, chances are the October SAT and ACT would be the last dates they would take. But I will tell you that there are some colleges that even for a November deadline will still accept the November or December SAT or the December ACT. But you do have to get in touch with the college to verify, either calling them or maybe going to their website to see what is the last test date for an early decision or early action application. Most regular admission decisions for, let's say, more selective colleges. I don't necessarily mean the highly selective or highly rejective colleges, but for, colleges that tend to admit, say, 50% or fewer of the students, most of them have deadlines. The first week of January, which typically means the December test is going to be the last test date that would work for a regular deadline. But if you're applying to a college that offers a rolling admission or a much later deadline, then certainly you have these later dates to look at. The other thing to know about is that if you are applying for Bright Futures, the state of Florida has just lengthened the time for which you can actually take the SAT or ACT to qualify. And basically it used to be that you had to test, I think, in June. Now you have to get a test score by either July for the ACT or August for the SAT. So that's new. So you may say, okay, but all these colleges are test optional. What is it, like two-thirds of colleges are test optional? Like, why do I really even need to be thinking about SAT and ACT? So first of all, let's talk about, like, what does test optional really mean? By the way, it's not just a yes or a no, I need a score or I don't need a score. We de-emphasize the score. There's a lot of flavors of test optional. So understand, test optional is not test blind. If you are applying to a University of California school or a California State University school, so there's two different systems in California, they are truly test blind. They are not going to look at your SAT or ACT score. They may look at your AP IB scores, Not sure they'll look at your ACE scores because they don't recognize ACE the way we do here in Florida. But anyway, your test scores still play a role in admission if a college is test optional, because they will still look at them if you submit them. When you're applying to a test optional school, I'm going to tell you that admission is much more competitive. Many more students apply. Students who have, say, the academic record but don't have the scores apply. And of course, if I don't have scores to use as like one more point to make comparisons among my applicants, then I'm going to have to rely much more heavily on a student's academic record, extracurricular accomplishments, essays, recommendations. Those are the other like most important factors of college admission. So if I'm going to go test optional, I really better have an even stronger academic record or stronger extracurricular accomplishments. So essentially, it's a student's decision whether to submit scores or not, and it's a decision made individually for each test optional school. It actually complicates the matter, and many of our students do what I call differential score reporting, that if they feel they have a competitive score, they're going to send it to this college, but if they feel that their score is not competitive for another college, they're not going to send it. But it does require a lot more investigation to determine, what would be a competitive score. And by the way, that is something that we help our college planning students, make that decision. So if you want to get a list that's completely up to date about which colleges, have what their test optional policies actually are, just go to fairtest.org. It is updated, continually, so that you'll know where the score tests, are used in admissions, must have them, etc. Important to know that Florida's 12 state universities never ever went test optional. Test optional really started in mass during the pandemic, when students couldn't find open testing centers because schools were closed and there was no place to test. So many colleges went test optional. But of course, that's no longer the case. So we're starting to see some changes, which I'm going to talk about. Bright Futures clearly requires test scores, but they now, in addition to the SAT and ACT, will accept the classic learning test. And there's some really interesting data that I'm going to share with you. Unfortunately, most colleges don't share this data, so it's limited. But what we have seen from the colleges that are openly sharing this data, is that the kids who don't submit scores are accepted at a lower rate than the kids who do submit scores. Now, please don't, that's not a causal relationship. In other words, I'm not saying, well, if you submit, you're improving your chances. I'm not saying, it's an if-then relationship. Understand that students who submit scores are only submitting those scores if they feel they're competitive. These tend to be stronger students with, let's say, more robust extracurricular commitment. They just tend to be better students. So that's really the reason why we're seeing the fact that the submitters for many schools, tend to be accepted at a higher rate. So this is a list of schools, or a graph, I'd say, of schools that have shared their data. And you can see across the board for these schools, and these are all some pretty selective schools, not the nation's most selective, but they're pretty well up there. In every single case, the submitters were accepted at definitely higher rates. And in some cases, if I look, say, at something like Boston College, it's almost 3 times as high a rate of admission for submitters than for non-submitters. That to me is sending a message that I want scores, because look at how much higher those, admit rates are. So just moving a little further forward now into the future, it's like, okay, what's going to happen with test optional moving forward? So I'd like to just share with you a few relatively recent articles. I don't want you to, if you're doing the recording, you can take your time to really read this. But this came, from NBC News. that most college admission departments are not truly test optional. As long as any preference or advantage can be gleaned by submitting test scores, students who opt not to do so are at a disadvantage. I think that chart I showed you just now showed it. Admission departments use test optional as a marketing tool, promoting their own interests as they pretend to serve the needs of students and parents. Well, you may say that's pretty cynical, but what happens is when you're test optional, you're going to get many, many more applications from, let's say, strong students who don't have as top scores. And when more students apply, it doesn't mean that more students are going to be accepted. They're going to accept the same roughly number of students regardless of how many apply. And so that's going to make the admit percent go down. It's going to improve a college's rank in U.S. News and World Report. That's going to drive more applications, for the following year. Okay, so NBC News, the opinion piece, I think, is a pretty reliable resource. By the way, at the bottom of these screens, I do have the actual link if you want to go to the original article and read it. So very recently, 6 months ago, the New York Times had this piece about the misguided war on the SAT. And they're saying that, the loss of SAT and ACT scores has become a problem. Without test scores, admission officers sometimes struggle to distinguish between applicants who are likely to thrive at selective colleges and those likely to struggle. Why? Because high school grades do not always provide enough information, especially because of grade inflation in recent years. I don't have the exact numbers on hand, but they're pretty easy to Google to see the percentage of students who were graduating high school with an A or A plus or even A minus average, that perhaps way back in the day when I was applying to college, it was, a low number. I don't know what it was. Let's just guess and say maybe it was 40% or 50%. I'm not sure. And if we look at it today, it's jumped up very significantly. It's like, hello, it's like everyone gets a trophy, like almost everyone gets an A. So test scores, by contrast, seem to be useful at identifying students from disadvantaged backgrounds who have enormous potential, even if their scores aren't quite as high on average as those of well-off applicants. Shortly after that New York Times article, there was another piece from the New York Times in the Daily that goes into even more detail. It's a podcast about the messy fight, over the SAT. And again, I'm giving you the link so that you could find it and listen to it and, gain more insight. So, MIT, I'd say, led the brigade when they reinstated testing for this year. And they came right out and said, hey, tests really help us. It's one more data point. And it's really useful for a more socioeconomically disadvantaged student because they're able to interpret test score in context of who the student is, so that the expectation for a well-resourced student might be, let's say, I don't know, and I'm just guessing at numbers, but I'm probably close to pretty accurate. For a really well-resourced student coming from, let's say, upper middle-class family, a high school that sends most of the kids on to college, perhaps they're looking for a score in the mid-1500s for the SAT. But if a student is socioeconomically disadvantaged, or perhaps comes from a school that doesn't offer like great college counseling or a full range of AP or IB courses, perhaps the score that would really set that student apart is a 1400. And so MIT feels that having a testing requirement is just more transparent, just much more equitable, and it gives them another marker to more easily predict student success. So when MIT made that announcement, it was joining universities that have already made that announcement and switched from test optional to test required. The two hardest state universities to get into Georgia Tech and UGA, Purdue out in Indiana, and Georgetown University had previously made the announcement that they were going to require tests. And let's look at just a few selective colleges more recently in terms of what they said. There was, an admission officer conducting a tour at Boston College, basically said that, our test optional policy is still in effect for the next year. It should be simple, but I'm sure you're seeing that it's not, depending upon what colleges you visit. Testing has definitely crept back. Last year, 2/3 of our admitted students submitted scores. Hey, a lot more than half submitted scores, right? 1450 to 1520 is our mid 50%. But bear in mind, that's only the best scores that have been submitted by applicants over the last few years. So it makes it appear that BC is much harder to get into. Looking at Brown, its president said, again, very recently, standardized test scores are a much better predictor of academic success than high school grades, which are exceptional for the vast majority of Brown applicants, but also carry the complication of being increasingly subject to grade inflation. Cornell, the former vice provost for admission, for my colleagues among the highly selectives, we are mostly in agreement that a student with a score of 100 to 150 points below our average shouldn't be afraid to share that result, especially if they have strong grades and a significant hook in their application. And here's the really telling part. If 13 students from the same high school applied to Cornell, and that's pretty common from many of our local public schools, and 12 of the 13 submitted scores, I would assume that the single student had a significantly below average result. They're probably not acceptable for admission here. Okay? So they're sort of imputing, what the score might be if that's one student, or maybe it was 2 or 3 students who didn't submit. This is even more interesting as we look at Dartmouth. Way back in 2020, I think Lee Coffin, their vice president and dean of admission, was trying to convince people, and maybe it was true in 2020, that optional is not a trick word. It's not a wink that signals a continued institutional preference for the upcoming admission cycle. This is not a moment for euphemisms or gimmick. There should be no parsing of intent with this amended testing policy. So he was trying to convince people that optional is really optional. If you don't submit, it's not going to hurt you. And that may have been the case during the first year of the pandemic when many schools were closed and learning was virtual. Oh, but that was in 2020. Look what he said last year. What a change of heart here. We encourage students to submit scores regardless of how they may compare to scores on historical Dartmouth class profiles. He's changing his tune a little bit. And look what he just said the other day. I've become less convinced that test optional is working for us at Dartmouth. We're reanimating the process based on evidence. So as some of you may know, on Monday, just this week, Monday, Dartmouth reinstated the requirement for SAT or ACT. It is the first of the 8 Ivy League institutions to reinstate it. And a few things in that decision, and this I took from the Wall Street Journal article. There was the same time the New York Times article came out, but I just chose to get my quotes from Wall Street Journal. They were pretty similar. We're making the move based on new research showing that at Ivy League and other highly selective schools, standardized test scores help predict first-year college performance even better than high school grades do. And of course, you know that that's because of the grade inflation. And finally, they said, under the test optional policy, low-income applicants withheld their scores even when those results would have helped make their application stand out. Less advantaged applicants who submitted a 1400 score had twice the probability of admission to Dartmouth as more advantaged students with the same score. And again, that's because Dartmouth, like most schools, evaluates a student in context of his or her background, family, neighborhood, high school attended, opportunities available to that student. Towards the end of last year, a statement from College Board, and of course one might say that, okay, well, College Board is a little bit more, prejudiced towards taking the test because after all, that's a source of income for them. But they did make the announcement that more than 1.9 million students in the high school class of 2023 took the SAT at least once, and that was up from 1.7 million in 2022. So a bigger share of test takers than ever, 2/3 of them, took the SAT through SAT School Day, and you probably have a child or that goes to a school that is offering the School Day SAT on a date this coming March. So this is just a graphic. I looked up and gotten the actual data from each of the years, and you can see that, pandemic, well, kids were still testing in parts of 2020, but in 2021, when so many test centers were closed, and test optional, I think really did mean optional. It did. Look at the increase. We're almost at 2 million students taking the SAT, and we're just starting to get back to some of the pre-pandemic rates. So, contrary to popular opinion, I certainly don't think the SAT and ACT are dead. Jason, any? Okay, so you asked about test prep. So I'm going to tell you that we at Score at the Top have you covered. We've actually partnered with 3 other test prep providers across the nation, and we've developed our own digital test prep platform. It's called Assessive, and it has lots of practice on it. Lots of practice test questions, and we're going to be launching it very, very soon. We're just finishing up some beta testing now. In terms of additional test prep materials, so College Board has made available right now 4 digital SATs, I think 1 digital PSAT. There are 4 more digital SATs promised. I think 2 of them are going to be coming out. I've heard through the grapevine, 2 of them will be coming out, I think, before this next SAT. The other 2 may not be coming out for a while. The College Board has also made available 4 linear tests. They're supposed to be practice for kids who know that they have an accommodation that will allow them to take a paper and pencil test. But honestly, there's great questions in there, and we're making full use of that with prepping our students for the SAT. And we are constantly reviewing other materials that are coming out. There's definitely a test bank of questions that College Board has made available, so that we're able to organize those questions into sort of themes and be able to give kids great stuff to practice with. So we think we've got our kids covered, and we'll find out when they take this March test. We certainly have them covered for the digital PSAT. So, we do hope that you'll choose Score at the Top for test prep, and whether it's a SAT or ACT or even AP and IB and ACE, and those exams are coming up. And we do wonderful small group, virtual, and private one-on-one test prep for each of these. If you've enjoyed this webinar and found it beneficial, some of our other more popular webinars, which are on scorewebinars.com, and you'll be able to download any handouts that we had with them. I think there's some great stuff that can help students in terms of navigating the world of college admission. Every summer we do a boot camp. We don't have our dates completely settled yet, but you can at least sign up your interest on scorebootcamp.com, and you'll have an opportunity, if you join us, to really go through almost a major part of the college application process, finishing your Common App, writing essays. You'll even get one-on-one work with a private essay coach. And one of the things we're offering right now, based on a webinar that we just recently did, is you can sign up to learn how to recalculate your GPA the way colleges do, because many colleges, in fact, perhaps most of them, do recalculate. The GPA that's on your transcript is not necessarily the one that's being used in college admissions. And we can help you plan your course progression for next year, and help you better position yourself for college admission. And certainly we hope you'll tell your friends about us. I've got our website, our email, and our phone number if you'd like to learn more about either our college admissions work or our test prep work. And now I'm happy to answer any other questions
Do you know how Dartmouth acquired scores of students who are not admitted and were disadvantaged by not submitting scores?
Okay. So I think, so first of all, I think the article had a mistake in it because it said that Dartmouth had, colleges have access to your scores. And they don't have access to your scores unless you actually share them. And many colleges that are test optional, I shouldn't say many, some colleges that are test optional do ask for your scores after the fact, after they've admitted you, so they can see, how you made your decisions and maybe how they might have impacted a decision differently, but that's not uncommon. How Dartmouth got its scores of kids who didn't submit them and who were not admitted, honestly, I have no idea how they could have gotten them other than going out to the students or to their counselors. And although a counselor does not have permission to release your score either, only you can release your scores. So it's pretty unclear to me how they had that information, or if they really had the information of students who did not submit scores and were not admitted. But yes, they can get the scores for kids who did not submit, who were admitted, because they can ask for them after the fact.
That's it right now.
That's it. So, certainly, if you have other questions, you can, feel free to email me at Judi, Judi, at JRAEC for educational consulting.com or JRA at scoreatthetop.com. And I'd just like to thank you, for your participation this evening, and hope you have lots of luck in your college admissions. We wish you well. We hope we've, provided you with good information, and